John Van Donk asked that I would introduce him. John Van Donk, I did a video on my channel with John with sort of my standard randos conversation introducing his life story. I first met John on this little strange CRC community called CRC Voices. And John popped up, and he popped up just as he had done, after he had done the Camino Trail. And I thought, what is this? What is this? And I, at that point, had started making videos about Jordan Peterson, and then John started sending me personal emails. And not only was the strange man on CRC Voices, now he's writing me personally. And then I discover that his wife has a mother who was mother and father were living in Dixon, so then he starts showing up at my church. And then he's got all kinds of advice for me. And he seems to have a plan for my life, and it's a lot clearer than the Lord's plan, apparently. And that's how John and I got to know each other. And over the last 5 years, a really beautiful friendship has developed. And John breaks most categories you have for him. I think many of you have some vague idea. He's the guy that's always pushing on estuary. This man has done a remarkable number of different things in his life. And one of them was a Christian Reformed minister for about, how long were you a Christian? How long? 10 years. He was a minister for about 10 years. And then he wasn't. And part of his life, he wasn't a Christian, did not grow up in a Christian home. Basically wound up in a Christian Reformed church because he was very smart and he figured out all the rich, successful dairymen were in the Christian Reformed church and he wanted to be rich and successful. And he wound up just being Christian Reformed after that. So I don't know, a little misdirected. But when after Thunder Bay, I said, okay, John, it's your turn to do a conference. And I'd been talking to this church about how valuable this could be for the church. And so John and I were looking for that fourth person like we had in Thunder Bay. And we had a few names and we asked a few people and we got some no's. And then John was talking to one person that was a really good candidate for it. And the guy turned around and said, everything that you've described about this conference, John, you should be the fourth person. And John said that to me and I thought, oh, that's right, he should be. And I know he feels a little embarrassed about it because he doesn't have a YouTube channel or anything like that. But John's quest for a spiritual home in many ways has been his entire life story. And as you will learn from him, he has found home, or at least pleasant inns in one place or another. And part of the power of doing this conference in this church is, and John will tell you, when he didn't know what end was up, this community, not this building, and not even this church hierarchy, this community put their arms around him and said, you are ours. And that gave John the spiritual rest he needed for that season. So that's John. And John, this is why you should be here. And don't make any apologies, although you probably will.
Does this thing work? Yeah. Amazing. I was never able to preach without notes. So, anyway, in the spirit of this, of the name of this conference, not the theme, the name, Estuary Chino 2023, I intend to give you all an introduction into a typical estuary conversation. Less a well-organized, logically progressing academic treatise than some myopic mental meanderings. This will require some of your best listening skills, as are also required in a real estuary conversation. Listening is probably more important than we think. So listen up. I don't really fit very well with the real celebrities in this conference. As Paul mentioned, I don't have a real YouTube channel. I have kind of a fake YouTube channel. It has 11 subscribers, and that'll probably change right about now. I expect my estuary subscriber, or my YouTube subscriber list to double in the next 5 minutes. So before it was all family. This would be the channel where you can see my 3 daughters dance to the song Emmanuel. Emmanuel, so that. As well as find out which of the 3 wins the almond peeling competition. So, like the other speakers at this conference, let this serve as my brazen attempt to promote my channel. So no YouTube fame yet. You will have noticed that all 3 of them wear a suit coat. I don't. I did not write any book. I have no academic credentials. There is a Dutch saying, hij is een man van 12 ambachten en 13 ongelukken, which literally translates into, he is a man with 12 careers and 13 accidents. So depending on how you look at it, you could say that career-wise, I didn't accomplish that much of anything. And yet, I'm quite content at how my life turned out. I have some wonderful memories to look back on. This thing is already not working. Okay. I used to be as comfortable at breaking up a set of doubles as I was breaking down a side of beef. And when there's talk in the news about building a wall, been there, done that. Here I am. Well, now that's the ceiling, but the wall comes next. And that's from the inside. And then from the outside, I hung quite a bit of siding in my life. And I also spent a good part of my life in the dairy business. This is a modern milk barn. That's kind of where I ended up with, a double 10. But in the beginning, it looked more like this. I actually did that when I was 11 years old. I sat on a little stool and milked cows morning and night. So, in the last 10 years of my life, when I say hot tub, maybe this comes to mind. When I say the word hot tub, looks maybe familiar to you. But to me, for the last 10 years of my life, it was more like this. And this. So I was a hot tub repair person. And in a world of speed and comfort, like that, my earliest memories of speed and comfort were more like this. And yes, for about 10 years, I was also a pastor. That picture was taken in 1981. Trained and ordained to be a spiritual leader and a guide to people on their quest for a spiritual home. I'm going to get back to the leadership bit a little bit later on. But first I want to say a few things about that quest. What I'm doing today arose more or less from the fact that among the speakers at this conference, I'm the old guy. So I want to offer a kind of retrospective on my own journey, to see what I might have learned along the way, to reflect on what things might have shaped me, perhaps even prepared me to find the way to some sort of spiritual home. Or perhaps even help me to see that already I have entered into what might be described as a spiritual home. Now, that's not the same as looking back into the past. You heard John Van Donk talk about nostalgia. That's not what I'm going to do. Perhaps more like remembering what we might call a spiritual home to which we might long to return. My first mother-in-law, now there's a phrase. My first mother-in-law, yeah, that's one of the perks of divorce and remarriage. You end up with multiple mothers-in-law. In my case, 2. I wonder how many of you, or how many people in the world have a picture like that. Yes, they do like each other, and yes, they do compare notes. Anyway, my first mother-in-law, like myself, was a first-generation immigrant from Holland, the Netherlands, to all of you politically correct folks. And from the day she left Holland in the early 50s, she spent the rest of her life looking over her shoulder. She had left her home, but she never felt like she really belonged anywhere else. She continued speaking Dutch. She cooked Dutch meals and served typical Dutch delicacies. I can't help it. When I hear the word Dutch delicacies, all I can think about is herring. And so there you go. That's Paul and myself and our friend Job from the Netherlands eating herring last summer when we were there together. So my mother-in-law would regularly go back to Holland, sometimes for extended periods. She told stories about the old country ad nauseum. That's a Latin word I learned in seminary. I won't say that she was totally devoid of any happiness, but there was always that nagging feeling that her true home was behind her. Perhaps you too know somebody like that. Quite a few immigrants can relate. It would be interesting to study the difference in brain function between people who look back almost mournfully as they remember their true home in the past, and those other people who look ahead and who believe that the best is yet to come. Remind me to ask John Van Donk about that. Anyway, when I first began to think about the quest for a spiritual home, I landed on a weird association. I imagined there being a Jungian archetype for that quest, and that a fundamental symbolic expression of the quest for a spiritual home might be something like, are you ready for this? Bar hopping. It came to me when my 97-year-old psychiatrist friend, where are you, Gary? Just left? He wanted to walk out for this part, yeah. So my 97-year-old retired psychiatrist friend would tell me the story about when he first joined the Merchant Marine during World War II. Gary was somewhat on the small and thin side, but he decided early on that there was not really any good reason to be afraid of the big guys, because none of them would be threatened by a little fellow like him. And so they would probably leave him alone. Anyway, as their ship would carry freight to and from various ports, the men would go ashore and visit some strange and possibly dangerous places, mostly to go bar hopping. And Gary would join them. And on numerous occasions, he would make himself useful by not drinking too much and remembering the way back to the ship. So not only would they not bother him, they increasingly came to appreciate him for getting them back to the ship safely. A win-win situation. Yes, Gary knew all about bar hopping. It's how he survived World War II. But now I can't get that bar hopping thing out of my mind. I've done a fair bit of bar hopping myself in my younger years. The way I remember it is that you go with a group of friends to a bar somewhere, and usually in an area with multiple bars close together, like this is in Brugge, Belgium. There's a bar every other building. And then you're in this bar, happily drinking away and meeting interesting people. And then for some reason that was never quite clear to me, somebody in the group would say, "Let's get out of here." And everybody gets up and walks out, only to enter the very next bar, sometimes a mere 200 feet down the street. And then the drinking resumes and the conversation continues, and you're still with the same people and the beer isn't any different. Until sometime later, this entire ritual again repeats itself. I'm going to have to ask John Van Donk what's going on in the brains of people who go bar hopping. So now raise your hand if you've never gone bar hopping before. Okay, so those are all the wine tasters. They are the cultured bar hoppers. I suspect that wine tasting isn't that different from bar hopping. Do you really know what you're looking for when you move from one wine tasting room to the next? Do you really know what you're looking for? All we know is that whatever it is somewhere else, somewhere new perhaps. Oh, wait a minute, I got all these wine tasters right there. Okay. All right. So all we know is that whatever it is somewhere else, somewhere new, perhaps someplace we haven't been before, and all we know is that we have got to go. And I have a sneaking suspicion that the quest for a spiritual home isn't that much different. We don't know what we're looking for. We just don't know that it ain't here where I am now at this time today. It's either someplace behind us and we are somehow prevented from going back there, or it is something new altogether and we don't know what we're looking for or even where to look. For some reason, I don't feel particularly qualified to say much about what we have come to refer to as a spiritual home. I'm quite confident that the other guys will wax eloquently about home as destination or telos, or home as where we were given our original identity, even if the connection to our roots has been compromised, or home as some sort of profound connection to being itself, which perhaps will result in some deep contentment and a sense that all is well in the world. The Bible makes mention of some kind of rest that can be ours today, but also that there remains a restlessness that will remain, or that will not be satisfied until the end, whatever the end is. Some people talk about this as some sort of mystical union, a sense of becoming one with the ground of being, or perhaps with the entire universe. I'm not going there. I will leave that to the big boys who have a special language to discuss these things. I feel safer, more at home, if you will, with the quest part, with which I have some experience. You see, in 2016, my own bar hopping took a unique form. On September 1 of that year, I embarked on a 500-mile, 6-week walking journey from Saint-Jean-Pied-du-Port in the French Pyrenees to Santiago de Compostela, a few miles short of the west coast of Spain. I'm pretty sure over the course of those 6 weeks, I must have entered at least 125 drinking establishments. It's called Walking the Camino de Santiago. It runs from Saint-Jean-Pied-du-Port to Santiago, as I said, and people have been doing it for more than 1,000 years. That's the cathedral at the end of it. And here I find myself on thin ice, because the story can be told in several different ways. I could tell you that it started as a kind of a fundraiser to pay for the building of the Cathedral of St. James in Santiago, which began in 1075 AD. As any good fundraiser will tell you, people don't pay for brick and mortar. People will make great sacrifice for a good story. It's the narrative that matters. And so they made up a good story. Apparently, St. James, one of the 12 apostles of Jesus, was beheaded by King Herod Agrippa in Jerusalem, and James' disciples collected the saint's body and placed it in a rudderless boat. This boat floated from Palestine on the far eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea, all the way west through the Strait of Gibraltar, past Portugal, and up the coast of Spain, where it somehow ended up 90 kilometers inland from the ocean in what is now the town of Santiago. Remains of the boat, with the body in it, were found around 800 AD, covered with scallop shells. They look like that. And this, presumably, is the reason why the shell became the official symbol of the Camino, represented on all the mile markers to guide pilgrims on their way to visit the grave of St. James. When this story began making the rounds in Europe, people flocked to Santiago bearing gifts for the construction of the most worthy monument to commemorate this miracle. And people have been doing it ever since then. I know. I was one of them. Or I could tell you that there really was a boat. And that it was of a unique model only ever to be found in Palestine. And so they just assumed that whatever was in the bottom of that boat must have been the remains of the body of a saint. So they checked to see if any saints had gone missing, and they found out that nobody knew what happened to St. James, who had been martyred in Jerusalem. So they just assumed that it must be him. And they were amazed and grateful that they were blessed in this way, and they felt that they should share this blessing with the whole world. And so when the story began making the rounds in Europe, people flocked to Santiago bearing gifts, and the bishop, not knowing what to do with all the money, decided to use it for the construction of a most worthy monument to commemorate these miracles. And people have been flocking to Santiago ever since. I know. I was one of them. And so, I keep getting ahead of myself. And so in 2016, I walked the entire Camino de Santiago. So perhaps you wonder why a person would do that. I have often asked myself that same question. What I can tell you is that I had recently retired from work, and I had watched the Emilio Estevez movie The Way, starring Martin Sheen, a full 11 times. And after that, I just had to do it myself. I had also heard rumors that if you complete this pilgrimage to the Cathedral of St. James, you receive a certificate from the local bishop good for a plenary indulgence. And I thought I could use one of those to shorten my time in purgatory. But most likely, the real reason, I actually think it's another form of bar hopping. The excitement, the adventure, the great unknown, the need just to get up and go someplace different. So let me tell you a little bit about what it was like to be a peregrino, a pilgrim on the Camino. The first few days are the hardest. As I said, I started in Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, a small town on the French side of the Pyrenees. The Pyrenees are the tallest mountain range in all of Europe, forming a natural border between France to the north and Spain to the south. And it is on the first day of the entire journey that you cross those mountains into Spain. It's only 11 miles, that first stretch, but it's 4,000 feet up and 1,640 feet back down. We're talking almost 18 kilometers, 1,200 meters up to the top of the pass, and then 500 meters back down, all on the first day of the entire journey. I had done some training for a few months prior to the real thing, but it still was quite torturous. And that first day, I had some of the worst blisters I ever had in my life. But then, of course, after a few days of walking, you sort of fall into a rhythm that went like this. Get up at the crack of dawn, walk for an hour, have breakfast, usually café con leche and tortilla de patata, walk another hour, stop for a beer, walk another hour, stop for another beer, walk another hour. By now you've walked a total of 4 hours, averaging 3 miles per hour for a daily average of roughly 12 miles. So an average day included 4 stopover places, 1 for breakfast, 2 for beer, and the place where you would eventually eat dinner and spend the night. 4 places where people sat down to rest for a while, see some friends, go to the bathroom. So again, do a little math. let's say 40 days, 4 stopping places each day. That makes for roughly 160 places where you take a little break, sit down, have some refreshments, and notice the people around you. And you know, they made this point actually in the movie The Way, but it is actually true. Rarely did I stop somewhere where there wasn't at least one table somewhere where you could listen in on a heated conversation about what makes for a true pilgrim. What in the world is that about? People would take opposing sides around whether a true pilgrim can carry a credit card. If you ship your backpack to the next town via a taxi, you cannot be a true pilgrim. People who ride the bus and get out and pray a couple of beads of the rosary at every roadside altar and then get back on the bus and never walk more than 4 miles a day, they are not true pilgrims. If you walk with your wife or your husband, that cannot be for real. You're too distracted. If you don't attend Mass in every major town, you are a fake pilgrim. People who walk only the last 100 miles but who still get credit for the entire Camino, they definitely cannot be true pilgrims. Back and forth endlessly. There were times when I thought that surely those people who were arguing like that could not possibly be true pilgrims. That's another question I want to ask John Van Donk about. Why this obsession with true and fake pilgrims? You know, I would like to go back to this slide for a moment. And I want to explain something about that shell up there. Jonathan, if this is a directional marker, which way would you say it tells you to go? Like that way? Towards the guide, towards the path? Okay, all right. Okay. Now look at this. You see that? That's the map of all the roads that lead to Santiago. Yeah? And then, okay, back up one. And then you see the thing on the top there? The Way of St. James? You see that symbol of the shell? That is supposed to resemble all the roads that lead to where we are supposed to end up. So the shell by itself points in the direction of that way, right? Well, maybe not. Is this correct or not? That's correct? All right. And this, of course, which way would we go here? To the right? Okay. All right. How about this one? Which way are we going to go here? Or this one? Are you going to walk into that dark path there? There might be robbers or who knows what, pirates. And this is the... That lady was confused as well. Yeah. So what do you think? That the people who put up those signs, did they try to mess up on purpose? Or did they simply not know which way was which? Did they maybe misunderstand the meaning of the symbols? Just wondering. And this simple bit of confusion made me think about the trustworthiness of people who point the way on the quest to a spiritual home. I mentioned earlier that my formal training was to be a pastor. I have a seminary degree, and once upon a time I was an ordained minister in the Christian Reformed Church, same as Pastor Paul. So perhaps you wonder how that came about, or perhaps you're also curious about why I did that only for 10 years and then quit. So I want to spend the next few minutes talking about the place of leadership in the quest for a spiritual home. Actually, I want to say something about the leaders, but I'll mostly talk about myself. So I'm going to skip some important details of my spiritual journey for the sake of time, but let me just say that when I first became a pastor, it was for all the wrong reasons. Narcissism, self-aggrandizement, delusional pride. I saw myself as God's gift to the church with an ugly sense of entitlement. And then to think that I really believed that I was able to show other people the way. When my ministerial career took some less than optimum turns, I blamed not myself, but other people who, as far as I could tell, stood in the way of my success. Why were all those people unable to see what great gifts and skills I brought to the table? At one point, I convinced myself that if I took paternity leave to take care of our 2 younger daughters, churches would come begging for me to become their pastor. They didn't. Meanwhile, my wife at the time had experienced firsthand the disconnect between how I expressed myself publicly and how I acted at home. It was not a pretty picture. So much so that eventually she gave me an ultimatum. I could go back to working in the church if a job was offered, but she would never again be a pastor's wife. I sometimes tell people that the Christian Reformed Church owes a debt of gratitude to my ex-wife in that she saved the denomination from me. For this is when, in an attempt to save my marriage, I quit the ministry, gave up my ordination, and went back to the cows. When I took a job as a manager of a large dairy here in Chino, and then, I wish I didn't have to say this, but a few months later, having become convinced that my problems ran much deeper, my wife left me anyway, taking our daughters with her. And it was in the midst of this horrific existential crisis, having been abandoned by my family, severely downgraded from lofty ministerial heights, feeding not pigs but cows, that I had my prodigal son moment. I had a vision. In my vision, I saw myself being held in a hand. Now, I won't rule out that the vision may have been precipitated by the fact that for about 2 weeks after my wife left me, I walked around every waking moment that I was not working with a small statue that looked like this. Would you call that an icon, Jonathan? It was my icon. The prodigal son in the Bible eventually returned home to be with his father. And 30 years ago, I showed up here at Crosspoint Church, at that time in a different location and with a different name. It was called Calvary Church at that time. And I remember one of the pastors at that time who had known me before. We were in school together. He asked me if I'd like to preach occasionally. But I had rehearsed my lines. I'm not worthy to even sit at your table, let alone stand in your pulpit. But let me sweep the parking lot. That'll be good enough for me. And so began my journey with this congregation. And what a ride it has been. Again, for the sake of time, I will spare you many salient details, but there are 3 things I would like you to know about. There are people in this church who, without a shadow of a doubt, have the gift of hospitality. They know how to make a person feel welcome. I was essentially loved into this community. With 3 little girls in tow, I was invited into their homes, given a seat at their tables. I learned a lot here about the ministry of eating together, many, many, many meals together. I was made to feel loved, embraced, accepted, connected. Over the course of these 30 years, they became my people, and they made me feel I was one of them. Thank you, Paul, for saying that already. You had that right. But if you think even for a moment that I was suddenly transformed into a nice guy, you would be wrong. Mind you, I had my moments. I could be charming at times, but I was still as duplicitous as always and able to irritate and offend people without much effort. However, I got some therapy and was able to be significantly reconciled with my ex-wife, which made co-parenting a lot easier. And then I bumped into this guy, a member here at Crosspoint, who was into leadership development at a large company here in Southern California. Turns out that he was to lead a seminar on emotional intelligence or emotional maturity or some such thing. How about I practice on you, John, he said. Still somewhat oblivious, I wondered if he was trying to tell me something, but I agreed anyway. And we worked our way through a book called Emotional Intelligence 2.0. It included a few tests. I scored incredibly low. We worked our way through the entire book, meeting monthly. Then I took the tests again. Frankly, not much better. But tests don't tell the whole story. We became good friends, and we still meet together regularly. And along the way, I became a little more self-aware, which basically means that when I act like a jerk, I'm able to catch it a lot sooner. And then there's a group of guys with whom I met weekly with absolutely no agenda. We just eat breakfast together and go around the table sharing whatever is on our mind that day. We have only one rule. When it's not your turn, just shut up and listen. No interrupting, no questions, no unsolicited advice, and we've been doing this for almost 30 years now. And of all my involvements here at this church, this has been the thing that has most served as an anchor in my life. I definitely recommend having a few friends like that. And also, it was one of these guys who introduced me to Richard Rohr, a somewhat renegade Catholic priest who wrote a whole bunch of books, among them Breathing Underwater, 12 Steps to Spirituality, the Spirituality and the 12 Steps, Falling Upward, about spiritually letting go, and then my favorite, From Wild Man to Wise Man, an introduction to male initiation. I don't know if there ever was another book that grabbed me the way that this book grabbed me. What turns a boy into a man? Richard asked. And can we learn something from that? Can we learn something about that from our forefathers in prehistoric times? Fascinating stories about initiation rituals from ancient tribes, but also sad stories about what happens when boys are left to their own devices to figure out how to be a man in today's world. I recognized myself there. And the conclusion was inescapable. I needed to do this. I needed to go on one of those initiation seminars. And I remember it as if it was yesterday. The day was November 13, 2010. The place, a fairy ring of redwood trees where I had spent the better part of the day at the conclusion of a 5-day all-male retreat. During your time in the woods, Retreat Master Richard Rohr had promised all of us, you will experience the change that changes everything. I had no idea what to expect. What I would find, or I had no idea what to expect, what I would find, and what would happen to me. I just sat there quietly, surrounded by majestic trees that reached up to the heavens like Jacob's ladder. Earlier in the week, we had participated in various rituals designed to strip away the junk we surround ourselves with in order to suppress the pain of our woundedness, our addictions, our macho posturing, our nauseating piety, our well-crafted victim status. Doing this brought us face to face with the painful reality of our broken lives, realities that were different for each man there. The truth is, life is hard. For me, the wound was caused by having been abandoned at an early age by my father. He simply walked away, never to return. As a result, I grew up feeling different from my peers. I felt like something was missing from my life. As an adult, looking back at the various stages of my life, it seemed as though much of the time I had been looking for the perfect father to make up for my childhood loss, all to no avail. With that painful awareness, I was sent into the woods that day, along with the promise that God wanted to touch me at the precise point of my need, to heal me with the change that changes everything. So there I sat among the trees, waiting. That's not my style usually, to just wait. I like to make things happen. So I whittled a stick, took a nap, whittled some more. By now it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon and nothing had happened yet. Don't just sit there, do something was my motto. Sure enough, after a while, I couldn't stand it any longer, so I took out pen and paper and began to write. Bitterly, angrily, I wrote down the name of a man I knew. Why couldn't he have been my father? And then another name. Why couldn't I have been his son? And what about him? He was a cool dude. And so on, and so on, and so on. He would have been great, as would he, and he, and he. And the list grew. And then it hit me. As I looked over the list of names of men God had placed in my life at one time or another, I realized that even though none of them individually had been a perfect father to me, between all of them together, God had provided me with some amazing fathering over the years. One of those men had taught me to work with my hands. One shared with me his love for books. One taught me how to drive a set of doubles. One taught me how to cut up a cow. One was able to boost my confidence. One was an excellent listener. One shared with me his love for books. One tried to tell me about women the best he knew how. Another showed me how to be a parent. In fact, the more I thought about it, the more it occurred to me that the partial, limited, incomplete fathering of all these men together added up to far better fathering than many boys receive from their own fathers who are in their lives for many decades. God had richly blessed me throughout those years, but I had failed to see it because I had been looking for that blessing in a different form. So there it was, the change that changed everything. But we all know that in reality, nothing changed. All that changed was my perspective. I received a revelation which allowed me to look at my life from a different angle. Sometimes that's all it takes for some person or some experience to force you to take a step back, to take another look, to reframe the situation and examine it within a different context and with different eyes. What I have tried to do this afternoon is to give you a few glimpses into my quest for a spiritual home, my journey, if you will. I'm a bit older than many of you, and I'm in a position to look back at where I've been and how I got there. And so after I established my amazing credentials, we heard about bar hopping and about how much of our quest we really don't know what we're looking for. We learned about the Camino de Santiago, the long walk with a spiritual purpose. We learned that there are different ways to talk about the same thing depending on what you are able to believe to be true about that thing. We were told that there may be a difference between true pilgrims and false pilgrims, but that often there is little agreement about which is which. We learned something about how you might find your own way on your own journey. We learned about signs and markers. We learned about the people who supposedly tell you which way to go, and about how often they are wrong. And we talked at some length about spiritual leaders. I don't know if I made it very clear at the time, but these days we can access leaders in many different ways. We can read their books, watch their videos, listen to podcasts, but how do you really know who to believe? The point of my story about how my eyes were opened about all the fathers in my life is that this revelation also, in a very real way, validated the words of the prophet Richard Rohr. He might not like it that I talk about him that way, but when he told me that I would experience the change that changes everything, Richard spoke as one with authority, not like the other teachers. And the fact that it actually happened, that my eyes were opened about a real thing in my life, that definitely added to Richard's credibility from my perspective. I never had that experience reading Calvin or Berkhoff or Berkouwer or Kuyper or Doyeweerd or any of the doctrinally vetted and approved authorities. Strangely enough, though, Richard Rohr is persona non grata in many Christian circles. Some people don't trust Richard Rohr because he does not sufficiently hide the fact that he may be a universalist. So that raises, in some people's mind, questions of truth and authority, not only about Richard Rohr, but also about John, who really likes Richard. Questions about, what does John actually believe? And when did he know it? And what does John actually know? And when did he know it? So let me be straight with you, as I've been straight with the leaders of this church. John has no answers to most of these questions. In other words, in spite of having received an excellent theological education, theologically speaking, John is still a wandering pilgrim in search of a theological home. But spiritually speaking, I'm absolutely sure that God holds me in the palm of his hand. And for me, that is good enough. Now, I would love to gain some more insight about how it is that I can be so certain about that hand thing. Perhaps John Vervaeke can help me with that question. I would love to better understand the symbolism of the hand thing. Perhaps Jonathan can teach me about that. I would love to learn more about what it means for me to be loved as I am by Crosspoint Church, even while I am less certain than most people here about the answers to any number of theological questions. Paul may be able to shed some light on that. But in the meantime, knowing that I'm in good hands is good enough for me. Does that mean that I have found the Holy Grail? Thank you. Thank you.